please welcome electric recording artists from Boston, The Cars.
One of the most prominent bands of the late 70s new wave scene, The Cars' influence on the music industry spread well into the synth-heavy sound of the 1980s. I personally hold their best work in the highest regard. Whether hits or deep cuts, they're responsible for some of my favorite songs of the new wave genre. Their early work especially did an excellent job blending the experimental sounds of new wave with the commercially appealing twist. Their classic hits have some of the catchiest hooks of all time, and it's arguable they helped normalize the synth's role in rock music. But the passing of the great Rick Ocasek in 2019 and Benjamin Orr in 2000, the Cars' run seems to have come to an end. Though it is arguable the Cars technically came to a standstill in 1987. However, that's not to ignore the fact that they've released tons of great music. Over their career, they've released a total of 7 studio albums. 2 from the 1970s, 4 from the 80s, and 1 from a brief reunion in the 2010s. I've listened through all of them, and today I'll be giving my rankings on each album. This is The Cars' Worst to Best. Starting off, we have 1981's Shake It Up. This album's sort of a transition phase between the more eccentric Panorama and the commercial juggernaut Heartbeat City. There are still some classic pop rock songs like Victim of Love, Cruiser, and of course the iconic titular track. When it comes to this album's more experimental material, the band sort of misses the mark. There's this balance between guitar-oriented songs and the synth-friendlier material. When it comes to the more technologically driven music, the songs are sort of hit or miss. I like A Dream Away, but I'm Not the One sucks. The band's balance between rock and techno is sort of lopsided on this album. Anytime they experiment with a poppier sound, the songs sort of flop. The vocals are decent, both Ocasek and Orr do a consistently good job on this release. The lyricism is really weak off this album though. A few catchy hooks here and there, but I feel like the band doesn't really have anything to say or express on this album. In Panorama, much of their expression sort of filtered into their music. However, in the case of Shake It Up, you don't really have as many Best Friend Girls or Let's Go's. Overall a hit or miss album. It has its weaker points, but the good kind of balances out with the bad. Arguably the most commercially friendly Cars album, Heartbeat City boasts notable hits as Drive, Magic, and You Might Think. What do I think of this album? It's hit or miss, really. There are some songs I like. Hello Again is a great opener. You Might Think, of course, is a great hit. I like It's Not the Night and I Refuse. Stranger Eyes gives me Duran Duran vibes. So, why so low? Well, my biggest problem with this album would have to be its departure from the Cars' eclectic musical style. Even on Shake It Up, they still sort of had this unique sound no other band could capture, and it feels like the band just sold out on this record, caving in to producing the most 80s sounding record imaginable. Now, adapting to musical trends isn't necessarily a bad thing, just look at what Van Halen accomplished the same year. They delved into a poppier, radio-friendly sound with songs like Jump and I'll Wait. What differentiates 1984 with Heartbeat City is the sense that Van Halen preserved their rock origins. They did not forget who they were. And that's essentially the problem with this album. A lot of the rock elements of the earlier releases have been stripped away on this album. The music is far safer than the previous albums, and sways more on being a pop album than a rock album. As for the vocals, they're really hit or miss. There are some really good performances from Ocasek, Orr though, he does okay I guess. Drive, Orr's big solo, it's the drollest Cars song you will ever hear. And of course, it was a massive hit. Lyrically, it's a competent album with a lot better hooks than Shake It Up. But overall, I feel it was a slight misstep for the Cars. They weren't exactly pioneering the industry as they were on their earlier albums. But for a product of its time, it's a half-decent record. If you're a fan of anything 80s pop, you definitely want to check out this album. Underrated album. After the pop-friendly Heartbeat City, Door to Door saw the Cars embrace their rock side, with an emphasis on heavier guitar-oriented material. Now that's not to say the synths were entirely forgotten. Fine Line, Coming Up On You, and Wound Up On You are especially synth-pop songs at heart. However, the album certainly boasts a tad more organicness to its sound. David Robinson plays actual drums on a lot of these tracks. In many ways, this feels the least Cars of the albums. You do have the hit You Are the Girl, which is the most classic Cars you'll hear off the record, but personally I embrace the harder rock direction of this album far more than the artificial glam of Heartbeat. Hell, Everything You Say features acoustic guitars mixed with an 80s pop galore. Lyrically, it's not that great, fairly forgettable lyrics throughout. As for the vocals, there's nothing too much to scream at. The vocals definitely take a backseat to the slightly overproduced music. Ocasek and Nor are both okay, nothing too impressive. Arguably both their weakest efforts. So, why higher than Heartbeat? Well, I just prefer this album's tracklist. There are still some duds on this LP, Wound Up On You sucks, and so does Fine Line. But there are definitely some really great deep cuts off this album. The titular track, oh, I love it. Door to Door is a top 10 Cars song, I don't care what anybody says. You Are the Girl is another great song. Ta Ta Wyo Wyo and Double Trouble are both really underrated rock songs. Overall mixed album. It has its gems and duds. The first half boasts a consistently stronger lineup than the second does. That's arguably the album's weak spot. I kinda have a love-hate relationship with Panorama. My first listen through, I really dug this album, though the more I listened to it, the weaker the songs seemed. However, I'd argue this album is consistently better than the aforementioned releases. It's certainly the most new wave of the albums. If you're a new wave purist and think the first two albums are too commercial, then I highly recommend you check out Panorama. It's certainly the most experimental release from the band. I must say, the band was really tight on this album. Excellent blends of a harder guitar sound with a variety of different synth lines. Regardless of the album's techno inclination, the drums are still perfectly organic on this release. Great vocals from Ocasek and Nor, they really give their all out on this release. Perhaps the album's biggest fault would have to be its weaker lyricism. The lyrics don't stand out nearly as well as the previous releases. It's certainly a more forgettable lineup. However, the classic new wave era music and strong vocal performances keep this album afloat as one of the best from the Cars. Just a really good album, super underrated by comparison to the previous two releases. Favorites off this album include Touch and Go, Don't Tell Me No, Misfit Kid, and Down Boys. A modern Cars classic. This album feels like the band was trying to recapture the magic of their early material, with a modern twist. I think this method paid off really well. You have songs like Hits Me, Blue Tip, and Sad Song which sound like unreleased 70s Cars material. Then you have Soon and the excellent Take Another Look, which embrace a modern synth-heavy sound. However, this album doesn't forget the Cars as a rock band, and embrace their heavier side in songs like Keep On Knockin' and Free. Overall, I'd say this is consistently the best album since their sophomore release. The tracklist is a lot stronger than the previous albums listed. With the focus on trying to recapture the early Cars sound, the band filters through the overproduction that dominated the 80s releases. There are a few exceptions of course, but it's a far more stripped down release than the aforementioned Door to Door and Heartbeat City. And with that, there aren't any unbearable ballads, so that's a major plus. It's unfortunate Orr wasn't alive to sing on this record, but Ocasek does an excellent job filling in his partner's shoes. With age, Ocasek's voice had matured, and honestly, I think this boasts some of his best vocals in the band's run. As for the songwriting, I'll admit, it's weaker than Heartbeat. It certainly has its forgettable share of lyrics, but the song lineup is significantly better than the previous albums. Overall, really good reunion album. A great way to send off one of the best bands of the late 70s. Now please keep in mind my opinion on the best Cars album flips as often as a Weezer fan may on Blue and Pinkerton. To me, the Cars and Candy-O are two of the greatest albums of all time. This album alone is responsible for solidifying the Cars and rock history. A good majority of their greatest hits are from this album. Many have jokingly referred to it as a best-of compilation, due in part to its consistent quality. It's rare for a band's debut to be as amazing as this record is. The Cars set the bar incredibly high on this amazing launch. First, the music. Where do I begin with the music? Incredible blend of synths and guitars. The lighter, sort of poppier guitars are a stark cry from the punk scene at the time, yet they're nowhere near the level of disco. Some of the Cars' greatest riffs originate from this album, but the Good Times Roll is an iconic one, My Best Friend's Girl is another. The synths are great off this album too. I love the variety in their sounds from songs like Bye Bye Love, Movin' in Stereo, You're All I've Got Tonight. Again, sort of solidified the synth's role in rock music, what can be accomplished if you widen the use of keyboards on your songs. Songwriting is excellent, some of the band's greatest hooks off this album. Just what I needed, Don't Just Stop, My Best Friend's Girl. I'm gonna keep talking about the music, but there's not really anything more I can say without repeating myself. Ocasek and Elliot Easton do an excellent job on the guitar work on each song. As for the singing, Orr does an excellent job on this album. Ocasek's great too. Overall, the band's really tight on this album. There isn't any definable weak spot on this album's track list, not a bad song off this record. Not all of them are favorites, but I enjoy each one in their own way. Hits are great, deep cuts are great, whole album is great. Some argue the Cars never topped their first album. I occasionally fall into that mindset, but there is one album in their discography that's always battling it for first. Say Hello to the Cars' underrated sophomore album, Candy O. It did have its hits, the titular track and Let's Go are both iconic songs, but the vast majority of this album is criminally underrated. I love this album. The synths are far more prominent on this release. They don't delve into overly experimental, save for the minute-and-a-half instrumental Shooby-Doo. I'd argue the music is of substantially higher quality off this album. The production sounds a bit more polished. Songs like Nightlife, You Can't Hold On Too Long, and Got a Lot on My Head have the best blends of synths and guitars off this album. No, the guitar work isn't as distinct as the previous release, but there isn't a substantial drop in quality when comparing these two back to back. Again, very cohesive sound. The band is really in tune with each other. Just more excellent music all around, a bit more eccentric than the previous release, but doesn't fall too far from a commercially appealing sound. As for the vocals, Ocasek really steps up his game on this album. Yes, I don't care for the vocals on Double Life, but otherwise he has a really great outing on this record, especially on the last 3 tracks. The songwriting isn't as great as the Cars, but the music is so great off this album. I personally think it outdoes the debut. So many excellent deep cuts, especially in the second half. Candy O through Dangerous Type is excellent through and through, a better lineup of songs than my favorites off the debut. Candy O deserves as much recognition as the original album. It's one of my favorite albums of the 1970s. So there we have it, all 7 of the Cars albums ranked. The Cars are one of the best bands to pop out of the new wave scene of the late 70s. Aside from their debut album, and perhaps Heartbeat City, a good core of their material is vastly underrated. What do you think? Have you given the Cars a listen? How would you rank their releases, and what are your favorite songs? Comment them below.